very warm welcome back to this edition of Talking Europe. We're now back up in Paris in our studios here, and we're joined by the EU Commissioner for the Economy and Finance, Mr. Pierre Moscovici. Of course, in your native country this week, where you've been meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, a president that has put lots of French economic reforms on the table. He's not the first president to propose such changes for France. It hasn't worked in the past. Any reason to believe it will this time?
Well, first of all, the economic context is much better in France today. Growth is now, I think, above 1.45%. It was 0.5% in the first quarter of the year. Public finances are in a better shape. I would like it to be even better, but they are now at 3.2%. Of GDP for the deficit. So 3% is at reach and must be reached.
That's the EU
unemployment
rule,
is decreasing now. And so I think there is a window of opportunity, because when the economy is better, the necessary reforms can be implemented maybe in a less painful way by creating more consensus. And that's very important in France. So I think those reforms must be done. We delivered our country-specific recommendations for France as for all the EU countries. And in our view, things are very clear. The labor market must be improved. Professional training must be favored. We need to have a taxation system which is also more favorable to work. And I think this now can and must be done with a new majority, with a new president, with a new prime minister.
There's a stubbornly high unemployment rate, nonetheless, of almost 10% here in France. The French people, they can and have done in the past take to the streets to scupper any kind of reform, because they don't want to see their economy, change in ways that they see might be detrimental to their very precious employment.
I think that's, sorry to say that, a bit of a cliché.
I think there's protest planned for September.
I think the French economy is a quite strong one. It's the second largest economy inside the eurozone. It will be the second largest economy in Europe after the Brexit, when and if it happens. This economy is also a large market.
And the French people, they're ready?
We are, because I'm French, among the 6 or 7 strongest economic countries in the world. France is a member of G7, so let's not have a caricature. This country is capable of reforming itself. It's not a conservative country, so let's try to do that. I'm confident that this can be done, and I'm sure that this must be done.
Okay, well, certainly the current president and prime minister feel the same. We were hearing this week from the new prime minister, Edouard Philippe, who's outlining his plans for France's economy, saying that the country was addicted to public debt, and that was something that he definitely wanted to see changed, saying that the country was dancing on a volcano that was rumbling ever louder. Here's a quick look at what he proposes.
How to breathe life into France's economy. According to Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, it starts with the government tightening its belt.
The French are addicted to public spending, and like any addiction, it will not solve any of the problems that it's supposed to alleviate. And like any addiction, it requires strong will and courage to overcome.
As of the last quarter of 2016, France's public debt clocks in at 2.1 trillion euros, nearly the equivalent of an entire year's economic output. France's budget deficit is on track to reach 3.2% of GDP in 2017, exceeding the EU-imposed cap of 3% for the 10th consecutive year. Philippe pledged to bring that number down below the limit this year. To keep the budget deficit under control, Philippe says the government must cut its spending by 3% of GDP over the next 5 years. Next on the to-do list, boosting corporate investment by giving companies incentive to set up shop in France.
Corporations need to want to come here and to want to develop their business in France instead of elsewhere.
That starts with bringing down France's taxes. Philippe said the French tax burden would be cut by 1% of GDP over 5 years, with corporate taxes cut by 8% by 2022. But in order to rein in the deficit, 2 key tax reforms promised by President Macron were put on the back burner, one affecting company tax credits and the other reforming the national wealth tax.
You mentioned there a bit earlier, we heard it again in that report, this France's €2 trillion debt, and indeed their public debt when it comes to that level of GDP, still above EU rules. You have said that you're confident they will meet the EU rules very soon. When might that be, and what happens if they don't? Are there ever going to be consequences from the EU?
It must happen now. The Prime Minister yesterday, in his speech at the National Assembly, said very clearly that he would take the necessary measures so that France could be at 3%, and it would be better if it would be under 3%, that's our rules, in 2017, so that in 2018 it can be clearly under 3%, and so that France can exit the excessive deficit procedure, which now is only for two countries, Spain and France. Greece is going to get out of it. And I think that for this country, which is a very important country in Europe, which wants to take the lead in Europe, that's Mr. Macron's project, it would be a major factor of credibility as well economically and politically. So I'm quite confident that the government wants to make those efforts. I'm also confident that they can make these efforts. And you ask me, what if?
EU side, yeah, exactly. What if? Are there ever consequences?
I'm not the one who is always advocating for punishment, for sanctions. I think that the best with member states is dialogue. And so I'm dialoguing with the government. I met the president. I'm going to dialogue with the prime minister, with the finance minister, and we'll find ways. So let's France reduce these deficits by being more competitive. That's for the economic side, and being more strict on budget. That's for the fiscal side. But Germany has surpluses as well on the budgetary side and on the current account side. So I'm also conscious, and Germany must be conscious of that they can invest more for their own sake.
Is there a willingness?
Because they need to for their infrastructures, but also for the general interest of Europe. I think that could be a kind of grand bargain with France on the one hand, reducing its deficit, reforming its economy and its society somehow, and Germany saying, okay, then we are willing to deepen the eurozone, to integrate more the eurozone, and that means politically too. In the end, there could be a eurozone budget, which is dedicated to investment, to fight unemployment. There should be, in my view, a Minister of Finance for the Eurozone, who would be at the same time the Commissioner. If you have a Minister or a Commissioner in charge who is also chairing the Eurogroup, you need to have a Parliament to control the Minister and to vote the budget. And that's something that could be derived from the European Parliament.
Okay, well, we did see one decision passed by the European Parliament this year when it comes to having a more common goal when it comes to all things economics. It was in relation to taxes. I know that there has been a renewed impetus, if you like, for this common consolidated tax base. I believe the decision this week was a directive requiring large multinationals to basically publish more their reports, what profits they made, what staff they have in each individual country where they make profits. Is that the case?
We are in the mood internationally, and especially in the framework of the G20 and the OECD, where we are in what I call a revolution for transparency, where the public powers are willing to fight tax fraud, tax evasion, profit shifting. And we've made huge progress on that with automatic exchange of information.
Have people signed up to that? Countries signed up to that?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, there is no more banking secrecy in Europe. There is also automatic exchange of information on tax rulings, which are what the taxation predicted for investment in foreign countries. We have had two directives on fighting tax fraud and tax avoidance. We are making huge progress. And in that framework, there are two or three things on which I want to insist more. The first is that we need to have a blacklist of tax havens.
Tax haven, because the OECD, they believe there's only one tax haven left in the world.
I admire the work made by the OECD. I think it's very useful that they were precious with the BEPS initiative in the framework of the G20. But frankly speaking, it's not credible to have a list. It's not enough to have a list with just one tax haven. Everybody knows. I'm not going to establish a list now, and it's up to the member states to do that.
But it's being worked on as well, no?
One is not enough. Obviously, there is more than one tax haven in the world. And then there is another point, which is country-by-country reporting. That's what you mentioned. The fact that big multinationals must make public some financial
quite a
taxation,
lot of data.
informations and data. There is already CBCR, automatic exchange of information between tax administrations. It exists already since last year. That's also a directive that was voted in the EU. I think it should be public. And I welcome the fact that the European Parliament yesterday voted for a public CBCR. That is necessary because, again, I think we must not and cannot oppose competitiveness with transparency. In a previous life, I was Minister of Finance of this country, France.
Yeah, 2012 to 2014.
And then I proposed to the Parliament that there would be a public CBCR for the banking activity of the French banks. What happened? It is public. Did the French banks get weaker? No, they're not. If you look
But
at
banking and companies, maybe not quite the same. If you develop a product, you definitely want to keep some elements of your business secret.
No, you're not going to deliver your plans. You're not going to deliver
it's just
your
finances.
techniques.
And you think multinationals will sign off?
That's financial and taxation matters. And I think, yes, you've got the right to access.
So going back then to this common consolidated tax base, explain a bit more to us how that would work and why countries like Ireland are really quite concerned.
That would mean first that today we don't have an harmonized tax base. Each country has a tax. I'm not talking about tax rates. I'm talking about tax base. And if you want to have tax harmonization, if you want the taxation to be fair, if you want also countries which have a transnational activity to have a simpler way of establishing and measuring its own activities, you need to have that common tax base. Then consolidation is the fact that we must consolidate at the global level the activities of groups that work in different countries. And that is also expected by the business because it would create huge simplification. It would create also huge gains in revenues. And finally, it will also avoid tax fraud and tax avoidance. I can understand that in some country, you mentioned one, Ireland.
And it's not the only one. There's quite a few that are concerned.
I've been there a few months ago and I went to the Parliament. It was quite sportive hearing from myself. But finally, we had a beer, of course, and exchanged selfies. We are always welcomed in Ireland. But I can understand that some countries fear that they will lose revenues. And this must be solved. But it's not a reason to block the whole system. What I expect is that there will be, in the months to come, some progress inside the ECOFIN Council, the Council for the Ministers of Finance, and that we can establish that by 2019. The first step being common tax base, and the second step later being consolidation. And I hope that in Ireland too, there will be a new reasoning about that. And I can make here a promise to my Irish friends. We are not going to touch the tax rates. Tax rates belong to member states. This is a matter of sovereignty, and the EU has neither a right to touch on it, neither a will to move it.
At the minute, in any case. Finally, Mr. Moscovici, we also saw a deal. Not only did we see the G20 summit take place, where we have very different outlooks when it comes to the economy currently when you compare the US to the EU. But we also saw another deal being finalised on the EU side of things, a deal with Japan. A lot of people are saying it's quite as significant, almost as big as the one signed with Canada not so long ago. It took, I believe, 4 years to negotiate. Of course, you mentioned it earlier, we're now heading into Brexit negotiations. Will they be wrapped up in less than 2, or is that really mission impossible?
First on Japan, it's clear that there is a political agreement on a trade deal between the EU and Japan, and that is major because it would also mean an opening of the Japanese market for various activities, and I think it was very well negotiated. It's quite protective, and this involves our agriculture. So there is a EU-Japan summit, and it's work in progress. I hope that we can have that, and it won't touch on investment. For Brexit, it has to be done, because that's the rules. You know that from the day one, the 29th of March, when Madame May launched the Article 50, it takes 2 years, and that's really the first real round of negotiations will be on the 17th of July. There was a good start between David Davis, who is the British negotiator, and Michel Barnier, who is our negotiator for the Commission and for the EU as a whole. And they have settled working groups as well on financial settlements, on citizens' rights, which are a priority for the EU, and on other matters. We are very conscious that it will be quite tough, difficult, let's say, discussion, but we are also confident that we can find an agreement that would also mean that we keep a very close relationship with the United Kingdom. Even if it leaves the EU, the UK will be a European country, and we must not create a situation
could become a new tax haven,
which would be worse than before the accession. No, the UK won't be a tax haven. As any other country, it will have its own sovereignty on tax rates, and it can be competitive there. But if you are competitive on tax rates, you need to find revenues elsewhere. But I'm quite sure, and I work with that very closely with Phil Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that the UK will always be attached to the global standard established in the framework of the G20. I truly believe that we would be better with the UK in, as well the UK and the EU. I would say especially the UK. The door is still open, but we need to have that negotiation. We need to lead it seriously, but I hope really that we can find a good deal, a mutually accepted good deal.
Okay, Mr. Pierre Moscovici, thanks so much for your time those financial insights. That sadly brings us already to the end of this show. Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. Have a good week and see you again next time.